Now, Janie McIver, a BBC Scotland reporter, is in New York. She's been on the streets of New York today. And Janie, what sort of scenes did you witness on the streets?
Well, I got to within about 15 or 20 minutes walk of where the World Trade Center stood. And the scene was one, panic is too strong a word, but one of real fear and concern. This is very much the kind of incident which New Yorkers have so long worried about in the back of their minds. It was almost a one-way flow of traffic as people and cars headed out from the south of Manhattan towards the center of the city, people leaving work, leaving their office and so on, as people on their trying to get through to their friends and relatives on their mobile phones to assure them that they were all right. The eerie thing, of course, is simply seeing the dense smoke where the World Trade Center stood, visible from so much of the city. I mean, I think we've all seen what it's like when a tower block has been demolished in a controlled explosion. It's impossible previously to try to simply visualize the amount of smoke and dust which is spewing out from this area. As I say, I was about 15-20 minutes walk away. I saw some ambulances leaving on the way back to the city centre, smoke and dust belching out of them, which one assumes the smoke and dust which they collected while they were down there with their doors open to receive casualties.
Now, we know that the World Trade Center is 110 stories tall. Some 50,000 people at its peak can be working there. Do we have any idea what the casualties might be in this?
Well, the only information which I can offer is what the American television networks have been reporting. I've been listening to the NBC network, which certainly at the moment seems to be trying to play very cautiously on the number of casualties. The figure they quoted a short time ago was 20, 8 of whom they believe were children. That's obviously a very early indication of what may be the case, because I think given the scene of devastation, it would be very, very surprising if indeed the casualty figure were that small.
Now, you talked about the scenes of devastation, the people trying to get home or get away as far as possible from the area. What is your sense of what the emergency services are doing now then? Presumably every available vehicle is there, and presumably also they're putting out calls for blood.
Yes, indeed. They are very keen to get everybody out of the area, and I haven't actually heard any calls for blood myself, though one assumes that will be quick in coming. What you've been seeing, Gavin, it's the public buildings here sealed off. The New York Post Office, the main post office building, a short walk away from where my hotel is, all the places like that sealed off for fear that they could also fall victim to a terrorist target. And as I say, people gradually leaving the southern end of Manhattan to get towards the city centre.
Okay, Jamie McIver reporting live from New York. Thanks very much for joining us.
Well, in the Middle East this afternoon, Israel has blamed Islamic fundamentalists for the terrorism, and the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat has condemned the attacks. He's been talking to journalists in Gaza.
First of all, I am offering my condolences, the condolences of the Palestinian people to the American President Bush, to his government, to the American people for this terrible act. We are completely shocked, unbelievable.
Yasser Arafat. Now, if you just joined us, the time is coming up to 6 o'clock. This is a BBC News special report. Let me bring you up to date with the events that we know so far. The United States has been hit by what's been described as the world's worst act of terrorism ever. There's been massive devastation, and large numbers of people have lost their lives after hijacked planes were deliberately flown into major landmarks in New York and Washington. 2 planes were hijacked from Boston and flown down the eastern seaboard to New York. At shortly before 2 o'clock British time, that's 9 o'clock New York time, the first plane hit the North Tower of the World Trade Center, and a fire immediately broke out. A few minutes later, a second plane hit the South Tower, causing more extensive damage. Approximately 45 minutes after that, a third plane crash landed near the Pentagon. 15 minutes later, at 3 o'clock, one of the towers in the World Trade Center collapsed, and approximately 30 minutes later, the second tower collapsed. A fourth plane has crashed near Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. President Bush said the afternoon's events were a national tragedy. There's no word yet on who is behind the attacks.
Well, following the events throughout this afternoon has been our diplomatic editor, Brian Hanrahan. He's still with me. Brian, one wonders how diplomats and politicians go about finding out who was behind this.
I think it will be an extraordinary task, but I've no doubt that they are even now at work. It is going to be difficult to find them, but it is a question really of looking through the techniques that were used and seeing how they can be compared. I mean, what strikes you about this is, one, it's very sophisticated. This is no bunch of amateurs who just decided to do something. It's clearly been planned for a long time. Indeed, there have been intelligence reports coming out that something was in the wind. And in fact, we heard 4 days ago the United States issued a worldwide alert to its citizens, but on that occasion didn't seem to imply that it would happen in America. It was warning people outside America that they might be liable for attack, as indeed has happened in the past. The other point which strikes us about this is that they have a great deal of technical capability. They were able to get on board the planes, they were able to get some kind of weapons, possibly bombs on board, and they were able, I think, to fly them, because I can't believe the pilots, even with a gun to their heads, would fly into a building. The other thing is that they're willing to kill themselves. That's a rare form of expertise. And also they have a capability of putting all this together and with a ruthlessness and ability.
Of course, does have an enemy within, though.
We would obviously need to remember that the last time there was the Oklahoma bombing, which everyone immediately assumed was the work of a Middle Eastern terrorist group. Those were the words that were used at the time. Turned out not to be at all. It turned out to be extreme right-wingers or anarchists, I suppose, in America itself. One can't discount those possibilities, but I have to say the finger on this occasion does seem to point in all its techniques and the sheer size of this operation outside the United States at enemies outside. Who they are, we don't know, but there is a great deal of suspicion that it will be Osama bin Laden. He is one of those people who's been named by the United States in the past as being responsible for terrorist attacks against its citizens. It has struck at him before, and I suspect that it will be willing to strike again if it thinks that he is the person who is behind this one. But at the moment, I imagine the United States is scratching its head and going through very hard with all its intelligence agencies to see if it can get any clues to what this happened. One help, obviously, is the fact that they did have intelligence something was on the way, and they will go coordinating themselves around the world. They'll get help from excuse me, they'll get help from everybody around the world now as they try to find who did this, because I can't think there's a government anywhere that would want to sit on its hands and not be seen to be helping out in trying to find this. And it may actually be a spur to some kind of new coordination and new attack on terrorism.
You talk about then having some kind of indication. Will some people inevitably ask then if there was a degree of failure on the part of the intelligence services? Well,
the intelligence service appear to have got warnings that something was coming, but not exactly what, and certainly not in the United States, because, as I say, the warning that was issued a few days ago did not specifically apply within the United States. It's also very difficult to do these things, but America has been, I have to say this, and it's always struck me when I've traveled in the United States, that it's very much a soft option when it comes to terrorism, because it does not carry out the kind of routine anti-terrorist checks, the anti-hijacking checks, which you go through in almost every airport in Europe and certainly in the Middle East, where you are checked at every stage to make sure that you're not carrying a weapon. In America, if they do it perfunctorily. It's not something they've ever really had to think about it, and I think this is probably, this is rather like Pearl Harbor. It's brought it onto the shores of America. When World War II started, America thought it was away from the troubles of the world. Isolationism was an idea that could take hold in America and be thought about. It can't really. Pearl Harbor demonstrated that couldn't happen. What this has demonstrated is that America is now connected to the international scene, and it can't opt out. The rest of the world's problems are America's problems, and it's discovered just how much they are today.
Brian Hanrahan, for now, very many thanks.
Well, eyewitnesses on the scene describe when the World Trade Center tower collapsed.
Trying to say, people, in a moment we heard a big explosion coming down. Everything just went black. Everything came down, glass started popping. People got hurt, stuff went on top of them, and it was a big explosion, and everything got dark, real dark, like snow. You can see behind me, oh, this is not snow, this is all from the building. It was a terrible nightmare.
Where exactly were you standing when this happened?
I was standing right in front of the World Trade Center.
So you were down the block here? And
right
you
there in the middle, right, yeah.
Did you get hurt at all?
No, not me.
Did you see anyone around you getting caught up in it?
Yeah, I was with the firemen. We got hurt. We all went inside to this dark. We was inside the building when everything happened, but we came out alive.
What's your name?
My name is Dr. Angel.
Were you able to assist anyone before this happened?
Yes, I did. I help a lot of patients. A lot of them.
Well, there are a lot more people that need help now.
So
if you're capable, maybe you should.
Yes, I'm gonna go back. I lost my ID, but I try to go back.
Yeah. All right.
I'm coming down 6th Avenue. All the people traffic was running up. And I'm looking up, I'm trying to call the station, trying to have fun where we are. And I look up and the tower just starts crumbling down. And everybody in the street just stops and started crying and bawling. And I'm standing next to a fireman, he said, yeah, they just bombed the Pentagon too. So that's basically where I saw. Then I came running down here. Traffic's not allowed past Warren Street. And you see what's here.
Do you know which of the two towers?
The one without the main antenna on it. The second one that was hit.
That's the further south? This more southerly tower?
I think it's Tower 1. I'm not too sure the exact.
And you actually saw it from the top down collapsing?
It came sideways like this. It just collapsed in on top of itself. It was amazing, but very upsetting to watch the whole thing come tumbling down. So we all thought it was another explosion, and we looked up. Instead of being two, there's one.
Well, I'm sorry about the technical quality of that, but you can appreciate there are extraordinary difficulties in New York at the moment. A few quick developments just in the past few minutes. Israel has now closed all its airspace for 24 hours to all incoming flights by foreign airlines. In the United Kingdom, here at home, the Ministry of Defence is confirming that as a prudent precautionary measure, all UK military establishments have moved up one security level. And we understand that all United States bases in Britain have also moved up to a higher level of security. In New York, the National Guard has now been called out to reinforce New York City police after the collapse of the World Trade Center towers. And we're getting reports of what President Bush has been saying in a stopover at an Air Force base in Louisiana. He's saying, we have taken all appropriate security measures to protect the American people. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts. Mr. Bush said that the United States had been put on a high alert status and that he has taken security precautions to ensure that the United States government will continue to function. What we know of the United States government is that Congress, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Departments of State, Justice, the Treasury and the Defense Department have all been evacuated. And you can see there the scenes in New York as the airliner crashed into the twin towers of the World Trade Center, one of the world's most notable buildings, now collapsed.
You've been watching a BBC News special on BBC One and BBC News 24 on the terrorist attacks on the United States. On BBC One, we will be back news at around about 6:30.
This is BBC One. Now the BBC News with Hugh Edwards. It's 6 o'clock.
America is pounded in the world's biggest terrorist attack. Thousands are feared dead after New York and Washington have been hit. Hijacked planes crash into and destroy the towers of the World Trade Center. The Pentagon is another target. The White House has now been evacuated. Nationwide panic as Americans try to understand the scale of today's events. Good evening. The United States was hit today by the biggest wave of terrorist attacks ever seen. Thousands of people could be dead after several hijacked passenger planes crashed into targets in New York, in Washington, and possibly in Pennsylvania. Today's bewildering event started just 4 hours ago when the twin towers of the World Trade Center were hit by 2 aircraft. Both of the massive towers have now collapsed. The Pentagon in Washington was hit and all major buildings have been evacuated, including the White House. The FBI believes the attacks were all suicide missions and several passenger planes are still unaccounted for. There's no word yet on who might be behind the world's biggest terrorist onslaught. As you can imagine, the chaos there is terrifying. We'll have live reports shortly, but first our correspondent David Loyne on what's happened so far today.
It came out of the clear blue sky on a mild fall morning in Manhattan. At first, no one knew what had happened. Could it have been an accident? Surely nobody would fly into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center on purpose. But 8 minutes after those first pictures, the full startling reality of what was going on became clear. In slow motion, you can see a Boeing 767, a passenger plane, crashing into the South Tower. A BBC correspondent, Stephen Evans, was on the ground floor of the World Trade Center when it happened.
I was on the ground floor of the building, sitting in a chair, waiting for somebody to turn up, as you do. There was a huge bang. It felt to me like somebody dropped a skip full of rubbish, a great container full of rubbish from a very great height, at which point smoke appeared everywhere, as though a mist had suddenly settled on the building. We all streamed out, some people running, some people crying, nobody really screaming, across the road, and you look up and you can see the top of one of the towers, smoke billowing out from it.
It is hard to imagine what must have been going through the minds of people on the streets below.
There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
We heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know.
President Bush was visiting a school in Florida.
I've ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act. Terrorism against our nation will not stand. And now, if you join me in a moment of silence. May God bless the victims, their families, and America. Thank you very much.
But it wasn't over, not by a long way. Almost as soon as the president had finished speaking, another airliner crashed on or near the Pentagon, the headquarters of the American Defense Department, causing panic in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. The White House was evacuated, and there was what looked like an attack on the State Department, which runs American foreign policy. Back in New York, firefighters were in the basement of the World Trade Center, wondering if the building above them was safe. But the nightmare went on and on. And it was all live on American television. First, one of the towers collapsed.
Thanks very much.
Completely collapsed.
The whole side has collapsed?
The whole building has collapsed.
The whole building has collapsed?
The building has collapsed.
That's the southern tower you're talking about.
Exactly. The second building that we witnessed the airplane enter.
The emergency services had cleared an area around the towers, but they'd not yet succeeded in evacuating the building. The people still inside had seen the other tower go and waved in desperation, but it was too late. And then the World Trade Center, proud symbol that it was of the wealthiest city in the world, was no more. At that time of the morning, there would have been about 10,000 people in each tower of the World Trade Center and thousands more in the Wall Street financial district around it. The emergency services have been doing what they can all day, but they are overwhelmed by demand in an atmosphere of terror. Every airliner in the air across America was ordered to land at the nearest airport. A plane crashed in Pittsburgh. As smoke blew across Capitol Hill, the heart of American democracy, it is clear that this is the biggest attack on America since Pearl Harbor.
Once again, we see terrorism. We see terrorists, people who don't believe in democracy, people who believe that with the destruction of buildings, with the murder of people, they can somehow achieve a political purpose. They can destroy buildings, they can kill people, and we will be saddened by this tragedy, but They will never be allowed to kill the spirit of democracy. They cannot destroy our society. They cannot destroy our belief in the democratic way.
In a brief break in the day, firefighters could embrace each other, but it will be many hours before their work is done, and many years before the full story of what this day means is told. David Loyne, BBC News.
Well, let's go live to Washington, and our correspondent there is Robert Watson. Rob, I know it's just 4 hours after this dreadful series of events took place, but what's the latest there this evening?
Well, the latest is that if this attack was designed to bring the United States to a halt, to bring the nation's capital to a halt, then it certainly succeeded. I've seen with my own eyes the city come to a complete standstill. All of the federal government buildings have been evacuated, including the White House. Now, you can probably see behind me to my left, the Pentagon is still on fire. There are said to be many casualties, almost certainly fatalities. Part of the building has collapsed. All around me, the streets have come to a gridlock as people emptied out of buildings. They can't leave the city. All commercial airlines have been grounded. The US borders have been shut. This is a scene of absolute chaos and devastation.
Rob, we heard from President Bush earlier on saying that all resources will be diverted to try to find those responsible. Is there any word so far from official sources there as to what their thinking might be?
Absolutely not, and I think it's fair to say that they are completely stunned by this attack, as indeed are all the Americans that I've come across. And you need to understand that there are thousands of people in the streets here in Washington, D.C. Nobody, of course, is talking about anything other than these attacks. But I think that the security forces were completely blindsided by these attacks. And I think that at the moment, the US government is in some sort of disarray because, as I was mentioning, a lot of buildings have been evacuated. The CIA has been evacuated. The FBI, they are just scrambling at the moment to deal with the devastation. And I think they're some way from finding out who did this and, as George W. Bush has promised, hunting them down and then punishing them.
Robert Watson, thank you very much indeed. Now, in just 4 hours, the United States has been under sustained attack. As we were mentioning, the first news of today's attacks came through at 2 minutes to 2. That's British time, of course. Fergus Walsh is with me here to talk us through the sequence of events so far today. Fergus.
Well, Hugh, let's look at how the events of today unfolded. It began in Boston when 2 passenger aircraft were hijacked by terrorists. These were United Flight 175 and American Airlines Flight 11, both bound for Los Angeles. They were forced to fly to the World Trade Center in New York. A third plane was hijacked at Washington Dulles Airport. That was American Airlines Flight 77, again bound for Los Angeles. It was flown to the Pentagon in Washington. A fourth aircraft, United Airlines Flight 93, from Newark to San Francisco, crashed southeast of Pittsburgh. Now, the World Trade Center in New York was the 4th tallest building complex in the world, 1,350 feet high. The Twin Towers dominated the skyline of Lower Manhattan. The first impact was just before 9 a.m. New York time, 2 p.m. here. The hijacked aircraft crashed into the 80th floor of the North Tower, each tower being 110 stories high. Now, 8 minutes later, a second plane crashed into the South Tower around the 65th floor. Now, the World Trade Center is the largest commercial complex in the world. It's effectively a mini city. 50,000 people work inside. It has 90,000 visitors every day. The casualties inside and on the ground are unknown. What we do know is that American and United Airlines say the 4 aircraft involved had a total of 266 passengers and crew on board. Now, within an hour, the Twin Towers had collapsed. Now, unlike most conventional skyscrapers, which have lots of interior columns to give strength to the building, the exterior walls of the World Trade Center bore most of the load, so the direct attacks were enough to weaken the buildings and lead to their collapse. Now, let's turn to Washington. Within 45 minutes of the attacks on the World Trade Center, another hijacked plane had crashed in a direct hit on the Pentagon. One side of the 5-sided building was completely destroyed. Just over 30 minutes later, a car bomb exploded outside the State Department. Again, there's no figure on casualties. American fighters are now patrolling the skies above New York, Washington, and other key locations to guard against further attacks. American military and government buildings across the world are on high alert. Other tall buildings in the US, such as the Sears Tower in Chicago, have been evacuated. America's day of horror is still unfolding. Hugh.
Indeed it is, Fergus. Thanks very much. And amid the chaos, the FBI and its international partners are already trying to work out who could be capable of planning attacks on this scale. Very few groups are thought to have the capability needed, and the Saudi rebel Osama bin Laden is one. He's currently in Afghanistan, where the ruling Taliban claimed today that he was not capable of an attack of this size. But according to Islamic Jihad, the attacks were a consequence of United States policy in the Middle East. James Robbins now on the search for the guilty men.
In the Arab quarter of Jerusalem, they're celebrating the massacre and mayhem in the United States. What's a disaster to much of the world is seen as a triumph by some. It's evidence of how much hatred has already been refueled by this disaster. Now American intelligence, which missed stopping the attacks, will desperately be searching for the culprits. And to find who's behind it, they'll first ask, how was it done?
I think it's almost impossible to believe that a hijacker could convince an American domestic airline pilot to commit suicide by flying into the World Trade Center. I have absolutely no doubt at all they had trained pilots. We know in the past that they've had pilots who have been perfectly capable of flying aircraft, and this can only be the only, I think, answer to this. American pilots would not do this, but Arab fundamentalists may well be prepared to.
Number one suspect has got to be this man, Osama bin Laden, the richest and possibly the most ruthless terrorist in the world. Bin Laden has declared the destruction of the United States his top priority. He heads and pays for an extraordinary international network of Islamic militants. And this evening, Israel's Prime Minister Ehud Barak told the BBC he thinks bin Laden is probably to blame.
Most probably a bin Laden-like organization, but I cannot say that I'm sure of it. But anyhow, it's an attack against our whole civilization, not just against the Americans. And I believe that this is the time to deploy to tackle this challenge head-on.
So what do you suggest that America and her allies do?
I believe that the whole leading kind of group of nations in the world, led by the United States, the UK, the European Union, and Russia, which is deeply understand the need to struggle against terror, will coordinate a globally concerted effort, diplomatic, operational, intelligence, and even economic.
Whatever the response, Osama bin Laden is already accused by the United States of bombing two of its embassies in Africa in 1998. 224 people were killed, including 12 Americans. It's only 3 months now since 4 Islamic extremists were convicted of those bombings by a court sitting in New York. Osama bin Laden was named by American federal prosecutors as the mastermind of these killings and a string of other attacks. Bin Laden is also suspected of involvement in this previous attack on today's major target, the World Trade Center. This bombing in 1993 killed 6 people and blew a 60-foot hole through 4 basement levels of the building. And this evening, many Palestinian and other Islamic militant organizations are distancing themselves from today's attacks. Perhaps they're fearful of American retaliation. A leading Middle East analyst in Britain hopes the blame won't fall on the entire Arab world.
It will stigmatize many innocent people, law-abiding people who have settled in the West. But what can states do? You've got to be practical.
Before today, the worst terrorist attack inside the United States was the Oklahoma bombing of 1995. And it was an American, Timothy McVeigh, who was convicted and executed for that mass killing. But tonight, nobody seriously believes Americans have been killing their own. And the mastermind for these latest attacks is being sought outside America's borders. James Robbins, BBC News.
And James is with me now in the studio. James, we've never seen anything like this.
Hugh, this is absolutely unprecedented. The Americans are already talking about a second Pearl Harbor with memories of that Japanese attack on the American mainland. No, this is quite extraordinary. And Americans are reeling. It's clear that the intelligence agencies, who are in disarray because they've evacuated their own buildings, they didn't detect the threat. They didn't detect any of the planning for an extraordinary series of concerted attacks. 4 hijackings, something the Americans have never experienced in their own territory. and coordinated attacks on this scale, from which I think American society will take a very long time to recover.
Now, you mentioned Osama bin Laden in your report there. Are there any other names that are being mentioned at the moment, and why is he at the top of the list?
He's at the top of the list because he had clear motive and he may have had opportunity. Osama bin Laden, this Saudi dissident, has pledged himself to a holy war against the United States, to the destruction of as much of the United States as he can possibly achieve in his lifetime. He has millions and millions of dollars behind him. He has many sympathetic friends among extremists throughout the Islamic world. He, of course, enjoys some shelter in Afghanistan. He has allies among the Taliban, the regime in that country. And although the Taliban are trying, I think, to keep retaliation away from Afghanistan, they may well still be giving him shelter. I think he remains number one suspect, and that's where the Americans will direct their initial thoughts of retaliation. But they've tried attacking him and killing him in the past, and they've failed.
And very briefly, James, fears worldwide that other countries may be under threat, and Britain included.
I think it's absolutely clear that all of America's allies will now be in a state of shock and fear, or be making preparations. There's been a massive intelligence failure. They didn't detect these attacks. They'll be fearful of more.
James, thank you very much for that for now. And here, Mr. Blair has summoned senior ministers to Downing Street for an urgent meeting of the Cabinet's Emergency Cobra Committee. He's offered President Bush any help he needs in the coming days. Foreign Secretary Jack Straw, Home Secretary David Blunkett and Defence Secretary Jeff Hoon have all been at number 10. Mr. Blair was due to address the Trades Union Congress at Brighton this afternoon. He cancelled that speech, but he had this to say about events in America.
There have been the most terrible, shocking events taking place in the United States of America within the last hour or so, including 2 hijacked planes being flown deliberately into the World Trade Center. I'm afraid we can only imagine the terror and the carnage there, and the many, many innocent people that will have lost their lives. I know that you would want to join with me in sending the deepest condolences to President Bush and to the American people on behalf of the British people at these terrible events. This mass terrorism is the new evil in our world today. It is perpetrated by fanatics who are utterly indifferent to the sanctity of human life. And we, the democracies of this world, are going to have to come together to fight it together and eradicate this evil completely from our world.
The Prime Minister speaking in Brighton this afternoon. Let's join our political editor Andrew Marr, who's in Downing Street. Andrew, any word from that all-important meeting?
Yes, I think it's probably broken up. The Home Secretary, David Blunkett, has just come out a little while ago. We're expecting Tony Blair to speak to the country in half an hour, and we've just been told that meeting is effectively over. It is a crucial meeting, of course, because one of the things that the Prime Minister has to do at this stage is to review the state of security in this country. COBRA is the crisis meeting, if you like, of the government. Got all the key ministers there, and they'll have been looking at security in British airports. They'll have been looking at the state of policing. They'll have been hearing reports probably about the world economy and the effect on that. The Chancellor's in the meeting as well. And David Blunkett, the Home Secretary, as I say, has left a little while ago. He's got a very busy evening ahead of him now.
And as James Robbins was telling us a short while ago, Andrew, a special concern because, of course, Britain is such a close ally of America and President Bush's.
Absolutely. Tony Blair made it abundantly clear. Immediately he spoke that he was standing shoulder to shoulder with President Bush at this stage. We've been very closely associated with American policy in the Middle East, too closely for some British politicians. And nevertheless, Tony Blair made it absolutely clear that Britain was going to be right there. There are implications, clearly, for British security, and that's the crucial issue at that meeting. But nonetheless, it's going to ripple right across British politics now. The Conservative Party, for instance, announced earlier this evening that it was going to put off for 24 hours the announcement of its new leader. This is going to be an enormous event in British politics, as well as, of course, across the world.
Andrew Marr, Downing Street, thank you for that. The events in America provoked near-panic reactions worldwide, understandably, as Russia, France and other nations announced emergency measures and airline companies struggled to cope with the chaos. Tom Simons now on what's been happening in Britain.
Britain's equivalent of the World Trade Center wasn't officially evacuated, but shaken staff at Canary Wharf
felt much safer outside than in.
It was a somewhat surreal afternoon in that we could see that all was going on, and then basically someone came round and said, right, everybody out.
Across the City of London, work stopped as horrified banking staff watched the television pictures from America or simply went home. Security levels at official buildings around the country are on high alert, armed police guarding America's embassy in London's Grosvenor Square. There'll be long delays tonight at Britain's airports. The complete closure of US airspace is unprecedented. Within an hour, all flights to America were either diverted to Canada or turned around mid-air and rerouted back to Britain, dumping fuel as they came. These American passengers had no idea when they'd get home.
The pilot came on and said, you may be aware that we've been circling, we're in a holding pattern. We are unable to enter international airspace.
BAA is considering a review of security at its 7 UK airports. In future, few airline passengers will be able to forget the way such an audacious attack so easily sidesteps checks designed to protect against terrorism in the air. Tom Simons, BBC News.
Live to Heathrow Airport now, and joining our transport correspondent there, who's Simon Montague. Simon, what's the word at Heathrow?
Well, of course, the shockwaves in the US have rippled to this side of the Atlantic. All US flights have been cancelled. Over at Terminal 4, that's the main departure terminal for the United States from British Airways, the biggest queue is actually at the hotel desks, where people are being told they may well not be travelling for 48 hours. Because, of course, even if US airspace does reopen, or when it does reopen, there's still going to be an awful lot of aircraft which are in the wrong place. So it's going to be 2 days and quite possibly longer before any kind of normality returns to transatlantic air travel.
Thank you very much, Simon, for that. Now, the Foreign Office has opened a telephone helpline for people who may be worried about friends or relatives. Here's the number for you. It's 0207 008 0000. That's 0207 008 0000. Now, there was understandable volatility on the world's money markets today. Trading was suspended on Wall Street, where the first attacks took place. Across the globe, there were urgent moves that affected currency and oil prices. Let's go live now to the City of London and our correspondent there, Rory Kethlin-Jones. Rory, what's the latest from the city?
Hugh, the city has shared the general sense of shock. A lot of traders left their desks to watch the pictures coming in, and when they returned to them, share prices fell very sharply. The FTSE 100, which had been up, was almost 300 points down at the close. I think at the beginning of the day already there's been a sense that the world economy was teetering on the edge of recession, and now we just can't assess what this will mean. This kind of shock, the economy really on both sides of the Atlantic has been buoyed up by the confidence of shoppers. People are still going out and spending. Who knows what this will do to their confidence and what this will do to New York as a major financial centre. And of course, London was the world's biggest financial centre, still trading this afternoon when this happened, because New York was closed. So a lot of the action was here. We saw the oil price also rise very sharply, and also the price of gold, which in past times has been something people buy in times of panic.
Rory, in the City of London, thank you very much. And we will, of course, have more from the United States later in the programme, but let's have a look now at the day's other news. A French court has blocked a bid by Eurotunnel for the immediate closure of a refugee centre near Calais. The company had argued that the centre has become a magnet for asylum seekers trying to enter Britain illegally. They accused the French authorities of encouraging traffickers. Eurotunnel say they will appeal. Our correspondent John Sopel is in Sangatte.
Last night, like every night, the illegal immigrants were